Our objectives in this lesson is to be able to find the midpoint of a segment in the coordinate plane. Also, to find an endpoint given a midpoint and endpoint of a segment, and apply the distance formula to find the length of a line segment when given the coordinates of the endpoints. Midpoint formula. Recall that midpoint is a point that divides a segment into two congruent segments. For example, if we draw a picture of a segment and then draw its midpoint, usually labeling it with capital letter M, the two segments on either side are congruent. We mark that with hash marks. Given two endpoints, finding the midpoint in a coordinate plane. Here's an example. Find the midpoint of the segment with these endpoints. Point C is 6, 1, and point D is 2, 9. Remember that the midpoint that we just set up here is like the point in the middle. We think of the middle. And when we're given numbers and we're trying to find the middle number of a list of numbers, we want to think of average. That's the midpoint formula when we average the x's and average the y's. Remember, in an ordered pair, the first number is the x, the second number is the y. This is the x and this is the y. In this point, this is the x and this is the y. We should always label points that we're given, especially if we're going to use a coordinate plane or a formula. Now, because these are two different points, we distinguish between our first point and our second point by putting the subscript 1 for the first point and 2 for the second point. Notice it's not an exponent, it's a subscript, a little bit lower than where the letter or the variable is. So the midpoint formula, we think of averaging the x's. Keep in mind this is a point. A point is written as an ordered pair with parentheses and a comma to separate the x and the y. If we're given two of the x's, here's an x and here's another x, we're going to average those x's. So the formula looks like this: x sub 1 plus x sub 2 divided by 2. Remembering that averaging is adding the values and dividing by how many values we have. Similarly, we have two y values, so we'll add the y values and divide by 2. This is our midpoint formula. Let's try to have our midpoint formula memorized. So usually we call this capital M for midpoint. Let's apply this to the points that were given. Here is our x1 and x2, x sub 1 and x sub 2. So in my order pair, I'm going to write the 6 and the 2 being averaged. 6 plus 2 divided by 2. Similarly with the y's, the y is 1 and the other y is 9. So 1 plus 9 divided by 2. And now we simplify. 6 plus 2 is 8, so we write 8 divided by 2. 1 plus 9 is 10, so we write 10 divided by 2. 8 divided by 2 is 4. 10 divided by 2 is 5. So 4, 5 is our midpoint. This isn't the only way to do it. We could also do it using a graph. Let's plot these points in our coordinate plane. Notice that we have some pretty high positive numbers here with the 6 and the 9. So we want to put our y-axis way off to the side and our x-axis way off to the bottom. So let's start by drawing those. It's helpful when we label our axes to label that this is the x-axis and this is the y-axis so that we remember. And along the x-axis, the right side is positive, the left side is negative, and along the y-axis, above is positive, below is negative. It's helpful to always label those. Now we'll go find our points and label them in the coordinate plane. C is 6, 1. So from the origin, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and up 1. This is point C. Point D is 2, 9. So from the origin, 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Here is point D. Ultimately, we're drawing a segment. So if I connect from this point to this point, that is the segment for which I need to find the midpoint. Instead of having to use a formula, we could count. Let's find the change in y from D to C. So I'm going to count straight down. I have to go down to go from point D to point C, and I usually prefer to go from left to right point. How many do I count down? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. That means the change in y is -8. Notice I'm heading toward the negative sign. So I'm going to write delta y equals -8. Remember that delta means change. So the change in y, how I moved in the y direction, is down 8. Now let's count in the x direction from where I left off, 1, 2, 3, 4. That means delta x equals +4. How did I change in the x? Delta means change. Change in x is +4. Notice I was moving in the positive direction towards the plus sign. If I'm finding midpoint, that's the middle. Remember that middle is halfway. So if I think of these values and I think of half of them, I'll get to the middle. What is -8 divided by 2? That's -4. What is 4 divided by 2? That's 2. I took half. So half of the change in y is down 1, 2, 3, 4. And half of the change in x is 2, 1, 2. There is my midpoint. I found it graphically. Now I just have to figure out what the coordinates are. First, I'm going to label this M, capital M for midpoint, and then count from the origin. From here, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. The midpoint is 4, 5. Maybe make yourself a note that we count from the origin to find that final answer. Notice we got the same point that we did when we used the formula. There's another way we could do it, and it also requires a graph. So let's go ahead and draw our y-axis and our x-axis. Once again, labeling x and y, positives, negatives, positives, negatives. Now let's plot our points. 2, 9 was D, and 6, 1 was C. Again, I'm going to connect the points to make that segment. Now remember in the last example, we drew the delta y and delta x, and it created this right triangle. I'm going to do that again. But notice instead of going down and then over to make a triangle, I could have gone from point C up and then left. I could have gone up and then left. Notice that makes another triangle. If I draw those two triangles, it makes a rectangle. So when we draw the two triangles and we make our rectangle, then we're going to finish drawing the diagonals. So we have the first diagonal, the segment DC. If I connect the other vertices, then I have my diagonals. Notice that my diagonals made an X. Well, guess what? X marks the spot. There's my midpoint right there. So think to yourself, if you draw the two triangles, you have a rectangle. Draw the diagonals, and then X marks the spot. Now we have to do is count from our origin. 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and we have the exact same answer we did before. Now you have a lot of different ways to do it. Have fun practicing.